And then after beta readers, I did line editing and proofreading before I sent it out to my ARC readers. So all of that with, multiple read throughs along the way, I ended up with about 11 drafts when all was said and done.
You're listening to Writer Unblocked, a podcast for aspiring and experienced authors. I'm your host and author coach, Nicole, and on this show, we chat with up-and-coming as well as best-selling authors, literary agents, and publishing professionals to inspire you and keep the vibe high. Today on Writer Unblocked, I'm chatting with Meredith Kasian. Meredith shares her journey as an author, discussing her debut novel, The Wielder's Discovery. We delve into the inspiration behind her story, the character development, and the intricate world building in this fantasy book. She also provides insights into her writing and editing process, the challenges of self-publishing, her strategic plan for the audiobook, which I co-signed, and the importance of balancing creativity with the business of being an author. Additional information and where to find Meredith will be in the show notes, so let's dive in. Welcome, Meredith Kasian, to Writer Unblocked. I am so excited to talk to you today because, like I said in my email, I devoured the book. It's The Wielder's Discovery.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about all things your process, the book, and of course, the Kickstarter to fund the audiobook edition. But first, tell me a little bit about yourself and where you got this idea to write this book, which is one in a series. So I'm excited to hear about what happens next.
Absolutely. So, hi, everyone. My name's Meredith. I am a mom of two, a wife, chemical engineer by day. I live outside of Philadelphia. And interestingly, that location is a little bit of the inspiration for this story, because when I was starting to plot out the story that I wanted to write, I had been challenged to complete NaNoWriMo by a neighbor friend of mine. You familiar with NaNoWriMo, Nicole?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It's surprising to me how few people still know about it, but I'm glad I don't need to explain. I guess for listeners who might not know what that is, it's a month-long writing challenge for authors to try to complete 50,000 words of a novel. So this was in 2023. My friend challenged me to it. We were going to do it together, but I had no idea what I was going to write. So this was like September. And I was like, I know I want to do this, but I have no plot. I have no characters. I know I wanted it to be fantasy because that's pretty much all I've ever written. And one of the prompts from NaNoWriMo to get you inspired about the plot that you want to write was to look at current events going on and use that as inspiration. So at the time, there was a mass murderer, not mass murderer, he just murdered one person. He was convicted of murdering one person and he had escaped from prison. And it was a fascinating story, a 2-week-long manhunt for this guy. They did eventually catch him,
I think I remember
but it was local to here, so everybody was on edge. Like, what's he doing? Where's he going? They were trying to track his movements, and my head's like spinning. I'm following this news story every day. Like, where was he? What kind of things, like tracks, are they following? Why would he have escaped? Who would he be trying to go and see? And so that's what really kind of got my wheels turning, and eventually inspired the story.
Oh my gosh. I think I remember that in the news, by the way. So that's fascinating. Yeah. Yes, mm-hmm. Because obviously in your story, the whole thing gets kicked off by an alleged murderer escaping a prison that no one else has escaped from. So it's a pretty big deal.
Yes.
So that was your inspiration. So that's really cool. And I think you said you did write another novel when you were 12.
I did,
right? Yes. That you're like, I'm never publishing this.
Never. No. So I have been writing stories for as long as I can remember. I, have memories as far back as second grade of writing stories. Obviously they were much shorter back then, but my next door neighbor and I growing up, we used to spend our days together sitting on each other's beds and writing by hand stories on paper, wide ruled paper, in binders or in notebooks or anything like that. And there was one that I finished around the time I was 12. She's the only person who's ever read it because we used to swap the pages back and forth. And it was the only one I've ever finished before I finished this one. So I had, over the years, many other novel ideas that never got past like chapter 5 or 6. And I've learned why now. But that one, the one I finished, honestly don't even remember what it's called. I still have it. It's upstairs under my bed. I should figure out what it's called. so that I can actually like talk about it with its name. But it's basically a spoof on Harry Potter because I was a
Oh,
massive Harry Potter nerd growing up, still am, honestly. And so I basically was like, well, what if Harry Potter took place in the United States and the school was here in the United States? And so it's essentially Harry Potter. The lead is a female witch instead of a male. And I tried to change some of the like names and terminology, but yeah.
I think that's lovely, and let us not forget that there's a lot of, great authors being born from trying out fan fiction
But
first,
and
right?
honestly, that's probably what it would be classified as now is like and at the time too, and I just didn't realize it because I was 12 and the internet wasn't what it is today. So people weren't really putting out the fan fiction that they are now. But that really is what it was. It was Harry Potter fan fiction. Yeah.
That's amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
well, we'll let it sit under your bed for a little bit, but who knows? Who knows if it'll ever see
Almost.
the light
If
of
I
day.
ever dip into young adult, that might be it.
Well, I caught you said you are a chemical engineer by day, which helps me understand a little bit about what's going on in your book because it is fantasy, but I was very impressed by your magic system and how easy it was to understand. And so I was wondering how your chemical engineering background influences what's happening in this book, if at all.
Yeah, so I mean, right off the bat at the beginning in the prologue, this isn't a spoiler because it's in the prologue, but we learn that there's a research experiment that's being going on in a laboratory, and it's basically a science experiment, but it's related to magic. So you automatically start to see that there are elements of science and magic being woven together, and for me, that's always been really cool because I think science is real magic, real world magic. Like it's kind of cool to think about all of the things that we have learned about science and the way that our bodies work, that nature works, like the fact that you can grow a tree from a single seed. How is that possible? Just
That
from
is
getting water and sunlight? It's crazy. And so, like, there's magic all around us in the science that's around us. And so that was kind of where I had taken my inspiration from for that to kick it off. I thought it'd be really cool if there was a way to look into, without giving too much away, the roots of magic and how they evolve and came to be within this world from a science perspective. So,
I love that.
yeah.
I know you open up with this mysterious lab and I was hooked right away. And I loved your main female character because she lives in this world of magic, but her issue, so to speak, is that she doesn't really have or she's a very weak witch, so to speak. Like her
Mhm.
powers are just not that great. And so she feels inferior to everybody else. And so it was interesting to see the dynamic between her and her sister who has magic and then her parents and then how it sort of shapes her character. Tell me a little bit more about Nova. Like as a main character, were you inspired by any particular person in your life? Is there a little bit of you and her? How did you come up with her?
She's definitely got a lot of me in her, especially in the like insecurity is a little bit lacking the self-confidence but eventually grows into it and finds her place. So it is a book about self-discovery and Nova figuring out her place in the world. And so, as I've gotten older, and she's in her mid 20s, and I think that's about the time I really started to figure myself out as well, in my 20s. It's a very pivotal time, I think, for most people. And so I think that's about when I started to figure myself out. And so having her go through a very similar journey at a similar age, I was able to weave a lot of my own experiences in with how she handles all of that as well. So there's a good bit of me in Nova for sure. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anybody else that I drew in for her specifically, but there's not. There's definitely elements of other people in some of the other characters and more so like movie and TV and book characters than like real people I know, although I think that a lot of us can say that we all know people like some of the characters in there.
Of course. Yeah. And obviously the developing feelings for your bodyguard trope, which I absolutely adore, and you've created this dynamic between them that because his first and foremost priority is to protect her, but then he
Mhm.
also starts to develop feelings. So it's and then it's all set in this magical world. So you created Misfell is the prison,
Yes.
right? And then you have Arkwood. And so was it, how did you keep track? Like, what's your process when you're writing, and how do you keep track of, okay, this is this town and this is this city and the classes, right? There's elves, witches, and humans, essentially, right? Are wielders,
Yep.
wielders are classified under witches.
Yes. So yeah, so within the witches, you have all the elemental witches, and then you also have wielders and healers, and they're all technically within the witch race. Is what I've called
Okay, so
them.
there's
Yeah.
three, basically there's three races.
Mhm.
There's all these cities and towns that you're mentioning, and I love the religious sort of lore that you've built, right?
Mhm.
Because the religion, it seems that, talk to me a little bit more about like the three deities that match the three races, but they're sort of connected. The deities themselves are connected as well.
Mhm. Yeah, so my idea was that they were 3 sisters, and whether they're, actual sisters or they're just sisters because they're all deities and, you think back to Roman, Greek, Norse mythology, a lot of them were siblings, but are they actually, or do they just kinda consider themselves that? Who knows? But 3 sister goddesses, one, for the humans, one for the witches, one for the elves, and they each kind of have their own temples, their own methods of worship, their own trying to think of the right word, but not the reason for being, but for example, at the Arkwood or Airmere Temple, where the witch's goddess is, it's positioned over a very sacred hot spring to the witches. It's supposed to be the stem of all their power. And so there is a city just like that for the humans, where they have a big temple for their witch, Tara. Then there's a temple in Besa, the elves' major city, that's just like that for their witch or their goddess Dahlia. And so, we'll get to explore a little bit more the others in future books, but we really dive into Kanta, the witch goddess, in this book and start to see a little bit about how the relationship that they have with the goddesses kind of, I'm again trying to think of the right word. The way that the relationship they have with the goddesses impacts the way that each of those races kind of views the world and uses the powers that they've been given, if that makes
Yes.
sense.
Yes. No, like I said, even in book 1, which is the only one I've read so far, obviously, it's very clear to me how this religious world is set up. So you've packed a lot in a way that I don't feel, as a reader, I didn't feel overwhelmed, because sometimes when I pick up a fantasy book, I'm dreading the amount of information and who I'm going to have to keep, not only keeping track of all the characters, but the worlds and the different names and the magic system, and like, in this case, religion. So you've done a wonderful job of introducing it in a way that doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to keep track of this. Like, it was easy for me to remember, like, oh yes, this city is for the elves, and yes, that's the goddess for the witches. And so I don't, how did, I mean, did you have an editor? What was your process once you were done with the draft? Like, what was your process to publication?
Yeah, I love answering this question. I love talking about my process because in part of my role as an engineer, I'm a project manager. And so planning this out from start to finish was like, I loved it. I did a lot of research and learning into figuring out what types of editing there were and also the everybody has a different but the right order of that editing and what I wanted to do for my book. So I knew that I wanted to get it professionally edited. It was my first book that I was going to put out there in the world. And I was like, I've never done this before. I have no idea if it's going to be good or not. And I really need somebody who knows what they're talking about to look at this. And so I knew I wanted an editor. That was like the one thing I was like, I'm willing to shell out a little bit of extra money to pay for someone who would be great. And my editor is absolutely fantastic. I adore all of the feedback that she has given me. So glad that I found her. So when I first finished my first draft, I read through it myself. And I think it's important to note that I tend to do a full read through for every draft, which I know not every author does. So it takes me a long time to get through my editing process. This book took me about a year from start of the first word on a page to publication. It was just over a year. And
Wow.
so I read it through myself. I sent it to my husband. He was my first person that read it, incorporated all his feedback, did a full read through. Then it went off to my editor for developmental edits. And she really looked at it from big picture story point of view. So, did we get enough character development? Was there enough romantic tension? Did the world building make sense? And so, I really think that the feedback she gave me helped me make a lot of it more clear because at the time it was like in my head, it's perfect. Like, I know everything I'm trying to say, but the
Right.
reader didn't. And so from the time I gave it to her to the time that I sent it back to her after developmental editing, it grew by about 20 to 25,000 words. So it was a substantial amount that I actually added based on her feedback. And I think that made a huge difference in the
Wow.
story. And I can't imagine the book without those scenes at this point. So after developmental editing, I sent it out to beta readers who are just, everyday readers. They're not necessarily trained in editing. They're just, a sampling of the people who would pick this up in a store and read it and give me feedback about it. I've gotten a lot of great feedback about how to select beta readers through other authors that I've connected with. And I thought it would be good to have a few that don't necessarily read the fantasy genre and to get their input as well. And so that actually really helped me. So I didn't have just all like the hype readers who were reading it. I had some that were also like looking at it a little more critically, like if this was my first fantasy book, would it make sense to me? Is it something that's still alluring to me? So I really appreciated that feedback as well. And then after beta readers, I did line editing and proofreading before I sent it out to my ARC readers. So all of that with, multiple read throughs along the way, I ended up with about 11 drafts when all was said and done, and still find typos even when I read it now. The printed copy and the Kindle copy, I'm like, oh, there's a period missing there. Oh, well, that's just how it's going to be because I am not going to go back and fix it. But it's amazing how you can still find those things. Even in traditionally published books, you
Oh,
find
you find
typos
them.
these
You find
days.
them everywhere. I know.
So yeah, so I try not to sweat it too much, but yeah. So it was a long journey. I'm pretty much following the exact same journey this time. I'm doing fewer beta readers and I'm adding in copy editing this time to help with sentence structure and things like that. But overall, following the same thing, the same
So you have
process.
developmental editor first,
Mhm.
then you do your beta readers, then you do your line editing, proof. Well, in you did line editing and proofreading, but this time you're going to do copywriting, line editing,
Yes,
and proofreading. And for those listening, what's the difference between a copyright and a line edit?
it's a great question. I'm still trying to figure that one out myself.
Right, and it's
um,
not it's not I'm not setting you up, it's, like, really there like you said, there's just different definitions and different ways
yes.
people approach the editing, and I've seen it just, uh
Yeah, so the way that I understand it, and I could be completely wrong because I didn't really understand line editing until I got my edits back from my editor, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I understand why you're doing that." And so I'm interested to see once I get the copy edit back how that works as well. But copy is actually looking at things like word choice, sentence structure, making sure that things make sense. You don't have like too many run-on sentences. So actually looking at the words, and then line editing is looking at literally like line by line, like is the language too flowery? Like my editor removed a lot of that's. There were a lot of the times I used the word that and it just didn't need to be there. And or things like anyway versus anyways, like little like tiny details like that. So they're really just looking at the words line by line by line and not in the big picture of the story at that point to make sure that things kind of flow that way. So when you get those edits back, just like proofreading, it's very easy to kind of just go through and say like accept, 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 accept. And it makes it very quick. It's not like when developmental editing, you get a whole like list of topics to consider in an email or an attachment, plus all the comments in the document. And you're like, okay, I'm diving in. They take a little bit longer to filter through all of that. Whereas copy, line, and proof are a lot more just like,
boom,
yes,
boom,
I
boom,
agree with
yeah.
this, except, yes, I agree with this, except.
That's great. Yeah, I'm also a process person. I've worked in operations in publishing for a long time, and I love a process. And so what you're describing just feels very organized and logical because
Mhm.
writing a book can be so messy. And then you end up with like all this stuff and this chapter you take it out, but now you're going to put it back in, and this scene you removed a scene, you forgot you removed a scene, the scene is referenced elsewhere. So one author on their own, it's really hard to just say, I'm gonna do this by myself. The misconception of DIY or self-publish is like this one lonely author, like in a corner, writing, editing, copy, doing everything by themselves. And it's like what you're describing and my other guests describe, but just no, there's a whole team, there's a whole
There's a
village of
team.
people.
Yeah. Big team too. Yeah. In my
Right.
opinion, the bigger the better.
Right, because being self-published doesn't mean that you
Just
forego
me.
quality or that it's just
Yeah.
you. It's you're actually following the same things a traditional house would do because It's just that they have mostly like the editors are in all that process happens just in-house. And
Exactly.
you're just building it yourself from scratch. Oh my gosh. So what advice would you give an author or a would-be author listening to this being like, I want to try this?
The one that always comes to mind for me, because it was very monumental in my process of getting my first book out there, was to take your time and to learn as much as you can about the process along the way. Because aside from the process of actually drafting it and editing the book, there's also all the different platforms you can put on there to publish. Do you need an ISBN? Do you need a barcode? What kind of cover do I want to have? How do I write a blurb? Do I need a website? What methods do I have for actually selling this directly? There's a lot that goes into it. Marketing, I don't even want to talk about marketing. That's my least favorite part, but it's a whole nother beast that you have to learn. And so really take your time and set yourself up for as most success as possible by doing your research and looking at all of that ahead of time to figure out what path you think is going to work best for you. And then after you've published, go back and reevaluate and say, did this work? Do I need to make changes? Do I need to take more time next time? Do I need to take less time? One thing I found was that even giving myself the full year, there were still moments where I felt like I was pushing myself a little too hard. I found myself on vacation needing to edit because I had set these deadlines for myself that nobody cared about but me, but I needed to hit them now. And so, one thing I'm trying to do with book two is to give myself a little more grace, a little more leniency, so that I'm not sitting at the beach with my family, stressing about the fact that when we get home, while everyone else is playing games or watching movies after the kids go to bed, I have to work on my book, which is still fun. I enjoy working on my book. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun, but I'm on vacation. I shouldn't
Right.
be having to think about that very much.
It's the
And so that's one of the
balance.
things I'm trying to give myself with this one, and if that means that it takes a little bit longer for book 2 to come out, then that's okay.
Yeah, I hear you on that because I spend my weekends crying over editing this podcast and cutting all the social clips and doing everything. And I finally got to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm hiring help because I want to also be with my family on the
Mhm.
weekends. And I enjoy this so much. I don't This podcast is a labor of love for me. I just do it because it's fun. And so when it starts to not be fun and there's too much crying, then I'm like, okay. So I don't want to quit. So where do I need to adjust and learn? And so
Yeah.
this even 11 episodes and this has been such a learning experience about process and creation. And I think one thing that I really identify with authors is you're trying to create, right? You're writing and you're creating and it's all imagination and the craft, but at the end of the day, it's a business. Like you said,
Mhm.
there's a marketing of it, and then it's like, "Oh, I just wanna create," and then now I have to worry about, like you said, ISBNs and how am I gonna move this, and is the button working when they click on it, and I don't know if you've gotten this far, but, like, taxes and am I is the accountant
Thinking about
is
it.
right, like, you have to have a separate bank account that's not commingled with your assets,
Mhm.
and then but that's a good thing because then you can
Yeah.
write off your author expenses, right? So
I did set up an LLC last year, so I did have that. I do have the bank account set up. All of that costs more money than I ever expected. So,
yes.
it's the end of January when we're recording this, and taxes are looming on my head that I need to figure out how to do taxes with an LLC now because I've never had to do that before. So, that's going to be a new fun learning experience, but I mean, I'll be able to write off so much. And I published at the end of November, so it's really only a month's worth of income. It's probably not going to be overly difficult at this point, but you still got to do it. It's still
Yeah,
part of the business.
you have to do it and you have to run it like a business. And I think the writing off is really important, right? Because if you're like, "Oh my gosh, I spent $1,000 on editing." Well, that offsets your,
Mhm.
so your tax liability. So it's good for authors to really think about this as a business, get an accountant, keep the finances separate and get some benefits. I have an author, I think it was episode 3. I mean, her accountant didn't even know she wrote a book until he saw it on her social media, and he called her up immediately and was like, "Is there a separate account?" And he had her set up. He's like, "If you buy the hair, makeup, and the clothing that she did for her book launch," he's like, "You can write that off. That's wardrobe for your book launch." So if you're gonna spend money, at least you get to write off, you
Almost
know,
everything.
almost
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about marketing, and then we're gonna get into the Kickstarter. So what platforms are you finding that you like to at least do the market? Like, I see you are obviously on Instagram, but are you using any other platforms? We don't know what's going on with TikTok.
TikTok.
Like, so talk to me about how you're navigating that as an author.
So I have never really been a TikTok user, even like I don't have a personal account. I never even had a TikTok account until I started creating one for my author stuff. And I created it about a month before the ban went into place. And now it's, who knows what TikTok's going to be. And so I'm just kind of leaving it there. Every once in a while, I'll post a reel. I'll like download the reel from Instagram and then post it to TikTok just so that it's there. But I'm not doing much with it. I'm most active on Instagram. It's the platform I'm most familiar with. I find that it's easy to use. There's a great book community on there. I've made a lot of great connections and friends on Bookstagram. I have been dipping my toe a little bit into Threads. That's kind of fun because you can go down some really deep spirals in Threads, but I find that I like that. I was never much of a Twitter user, but I do kind of like Threads for some reason. I don't know why.
I agree with that. Threads is it's I also just like the connectivity to Instagram. So
Mhm.
like if I there's a thread that I particularly really love, it's just one press of a button, it can post it to Instagram, and it's just seems more seamless, and the community seems more chill on Threads than Twitter. So or
Yes,
X or
yes.
X or whatever it's called. Yes. Yes.
And maybe
I
just
feel
because
for
it's newer, and so it hasn't gotten tainted yet. But
not
uh,
yet. Not yet. I feel for authors navigating the social media landscape right now because it's just that there's so much and
there's too much.
it's
So
too
I
much.
I created a Tome account when they launched this week. So, kind of just testing it out, seeing if it takes off or not. But at least I'm there. And the one I'm thinking about now is Blue Sky because that seems to be gaining a lot of traction. So I don't have an account there yet, but that's one I'm thinking about adding into my repertoire coming up soon. It's hard to manage a lot though. And so I find that like Instagram gets like 90% of my brain power when it comes to social media, and the rest are like, oh, I haven't been on Threads this week. What's going on over there? Or, oh, I have a thought. Maybe I should post that to Threads. And so I don't know how many I'll be able to manage realistically, or if it's just going to be mostly Instagram. We'll see.
Yeah. And you're posting, so are you managing that yourself? Like the
Yes.
posts, you're creating them. And talk to me about we didn't even talk about the book cover. Let's talk about the book cover.
Yeah.
How was that process? How did it come about? Did you hire someone? How did this come together?
I did. I did. So I started looking at other indie published books and going into their copyright pages and like who was their book cover artist, or going on their Instagram pages and seeing who they tagged as their book cover artist. And doing some research to figure out how much some of them cost. You can get a book cover from anywhere from like $99 to $2,000. And so I knew I wanted to be somewhere on the lower end for my first book. But I found this one artist who has worked with a number of authors, both traditionally published and indie published, and her rates were insanely good. And so I reached out to her via email or via her website, and we coordinated, got the cover done. I thought she did an amazing job. Like, just I had very little vision. I was like, I know I want her on the cover facing away, and I know I want it to be green and gold, and that was all I really knew. And
That's all
she
that's and
yeah,
she
we
took that.
went through a couple of revisions to get exactly the right background and all of that. And I wanted her hair to be braided because she always wears her hair in a braid. So we had to make sure that was good. And then we just did the cover for book two. I got it back about a week ago, and I am even more obsessed. I cannot wait until I can share it. And I don't know yet when that will be because I want to make sure that there's enough like excitement about it built up. But it is coming in the next couple months, I promise. And
Oh my gosh.
it is so good. So I
I
worked with
am
the
I'm
same
ready. I'm ready. I need when you're ready to release, I don't know, the first chapter, something. I have to have something to keep me from going nuts waiting this long. But and speaking of, do you have a newsletter?
I do. Yes, I do have a newsletter.
Okay. So we'll link that in the show notes because
That'd be great.
and if I haven't signed up already, I need to sign up because I need to get every update
Yeah.
that's going on around this
The
book.
link is in my bio on Instagram to sign up. I think I have it like all the way at the bottom, which is probably not where it should be, but it's there.
We'll find it and we'll link it
Yes.
here. I'm so excited for book two. But you know what I'm most excited about?
What?
The audiobook edition.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about how you're being so smart and strategic about how to put together the audiobook edition because it's not a cheap endeavor.
It's
And you
not.
don't want it to be a cheap endeavor for the end result. So tell me about what's going on with the audiobook and how you're making it happen.
Yeah, so I have gotten really into audiobooks myself in the last year. I think, the data's out there. I don't think this, I know this because the data's out there that audiobooks are growing massively. They are the fastest growing media for books for at least the last year, probably two. I think since COVID, they've really taken off. And so I knew that I wanted to have the audiobook to go with it at some point. Doing it before launch was going to be ridiculous because I was like, I have no money yet. I have no people that want to support me and back me because no one's read this book. And so I was like, let's wait until after launch. I've got my street team to help support me and get the word out there. And so the time was right now to kind of get that Kickstarter launched and help fund the narration for the audiobook. So I found an amazing narrator through Instagram. She has narrated a couple of my indie authors' friends' book, or she's narrated one. She's doing one now. And I think she does an amazing job with a variety of voices, and just the way that she reads and tells the story is really great. She's also a great hype woman. So she's really good at generating excitement about things and getting me excited about it and promoting my story and all of that as well. So that's been fun to get to know her since we kind of partnered together. And I'm really excited to see what it sounds like when it's all together. Like, even just the samples that she gives me when I hear her read my words back, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is surreal.
I am
So
I am
getting like a
um
full chapter or the final book is probably going to bring me to tears.
I'm so excited to listen to it, and I love that you're taking your time because a bad narrator can really ruin a good book. So
Yes.
we want to make sure it's done correctly. I will link the Kickstarter and I will contribute because I want to
Well,
listen to
thank
this.
you.
And so, Kickstarter has been around for a long time, but some people are still quite unfamiliar with it. I mean, you can start it for pretty much any type of project. How did you how did you land on like this is how I'm gonna do? I'm gonna get a Kickstarter. Did you
So
always
honestly, it's because I had seen this narrator and the other authors that I know work through them and be successful with them. And then I know that there's a really big bookish community on Kickstarter as well. So a lot of people will do Kickstarters for special editions or for new launches to help fund a lot of the startup costs and the printing costs.
right?
And so I knew that there was a good chance of success. Hope like with the Kickstarter, because not every Kickstarter gets funded, right? And so I did a lot of digging into other successful audiobook Kickstarters to figure out what had made them successful. Talked to some of my friends who had successful Kickstarters and kind of figure out what I wanted my rewards tiers to be, what was too expensive, what was just right, and tried to get everything to be in a place that set it up for success. So it was I knew that funding it myself was going to be difficult because it is so expensive, and to get that support initially from people who were excited about it and who wanted to eventually read the audiobook would help. It's basically like getting them to pay for the audiobook before it's published or before it's released. And then once it's released, I am planning to go wide and not be Audible exclusive. So it'll be on Audible, but it'll also be on Spotify, Libro, Libby. Find a Way Voices pushes it to, I think, also Apple. So a variety of different platforms, pretty much anywhere you can get an audiobook, it should be there. And it'll
Okay.
also have the flexibility to sell it direct, which is nice as well.
That is fantastic. And so you're gonna have to have, if you didn't already, your cover art squared
Yes, I
so
actually
that it
got that when I got my book 2 cover. I asked for the cover for the audiobook, so I have that,
good.
ready
So
to
you're all
go.
set. And are you okay, so the narrator will narrate and deliver all the files to you and you're gonna upload it to all the
Yes.
retail. That's just like your book. This is great. Sometimes I talk to authors like, "Well, I don't really have plans for an audiobook," and it just hurts my heart because I'm like, "No, there's a way. There's a way. There's always a way to get it done." And yes, as someone who also works in the publishing industry, in the audiobook publishing industry, the data is it's kind of mind-blowing.
Yes.
And I think I read the Publishers Weekly report that said print sales were down, but audiobook sales were up. And they continue to be year over year. I haven't really seen a decline. It's just for so long it was such a frowned upon format, and for many years it was very select books would be done but abridged, which also hurts my heart because I'm like, who wants to listen to an abridged book? But now the accessibility and the ability for an indie author to also have their audiobook format available it's great.
And you also have that whole debate of like, does an audiobook count as reading? And I feel like people are starting to swing the door in the absolutely yes, it does. And that demographic is getting bigger and bigger and bigger too. And so that's kind of helped push that, I think, a little further too.
Yeah, there's been some controversial articles published about whether it is or isn't. And to me, I mark them on my Goodreads.
I do too.
For anyone listening, I'm marking anything I listen to that is a read book on Goodreads. So
Same.
It doesn't matter to me. I've consumed it and enjoyed it.
I was about to say, I have consumed a story. It counts. Yes.
It counts. Like I said, I'm really excited. I'm going to be stalking your social media and getting on your newsletter and really eager, both for the audiobook and for book 2. And of course, to close our conversation, I'm going to ask you, what do you want to be true 12 months from now?
I knew this was coming because I've listened to your podcast and I was thinking about this ahead of time. I want book 2 to be published. So definitely that. I want the audiobook to be published, and I want to figure out a marketing plan. That's kind of my goal for me from the business perspective. So aside from the author stuff, which is audiobook and book 2, I really want to learn marketing and figure out how to make a successful marketing plan for me so that I can use it as a tool to drive sales and not just feel like I'm throwing money into a pit and not getting anything back, but actually start to see the return from that. So, 2 things, the author side and the business side, but that's what I would like to look like in 12 months, to be able to say I accomplished.
I love that. And it mirrors my desire in 12 months from now to be sitting here reading your second book. So I'm really, really excited for you. I really look forward to, we continue to connect on Instagram, and I hopefully will have you back on and we'll be celebrating the release of book 2 very soon.
That would be great. I would love that.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. For more information on today's episode, please check out the show notes. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast to receive new episodes right when they're released. You can subscribe right now in the app you're using to listen. And you can also follow me on Instagram @reignitewithnicole. Lastly, I do have a quick favor to ask before we go. If you're enjoying the podcast, I hope you'll let me know by leaving a review. Thank you again for joining me in this episode of Writer Unblocked. I'll see you next time.